Our first speaker today is a fellow No Kid Hungry state partner who has traveled all the way here from Texas. To introduce him, I'm happy to welcome to the state one of our strongest advocates, Dr. Alice Ammerman, director of the UNC Center for Health Promotion and Disease Prevention, where we've been based since 2014, and she is our fearless leader and our friend. Please welcome Alice.
So good morning, everybody. I'm really happy to be here again at the North Carolina Child Hunger Leaders Conference. No Kid Hungry has been a wonderful addition to our center since 2014. And this annual conference is a great example of the energy, spark, snap, and click that they bring to things. And I hope you think so too. As Luann mentioned, our first speaker this morning is Jeremy Everett. I just met him a few minutes ago, so I'm not going to do anything too crazy. Some of you who've been to these conferences may remember I introduced one speaker with a rap and another one with a song, but I'll spare him from that embarrassment this time. He is the founder and director of the Baylor Collaborative on Hunger and Poverty. And this collaborative integrates research and practice through a variety of projects, including the Texas Hunger Initiative, which he founded in 2009. He has many accolades, and I'll just mention a few. He's been named as a Next Generation Fellow, a Senior Fellow with Hunger Relief, and as he has an appointment with the U.S. Congress to serve on the National Commission on Hunger. But to me, what really stands out and is impressive is how repeatedly and intentionally Jeremy has, can't think of a better way than saying, put himself in the path of hunger. I'm reading his book now, which I highly recommend, and there's some flyers, I think, out at the table that will connect you with it if you're interested. It's called I Was Hungry. He tells a very compelling story about how he and his organization were very directly involved with addressing the catastrophic hunger-related challenges of Hurricane Katrina. And then at another point, he tells the story of how he moved his family and young children into a neighborhood where many faced significant hunger, and his family experienced firsthand what it's like to have neighbors who are kind of living on the edge, and I think his children must have had an amazing experience from that. The tagline from Jeremy's book is Cultivating Common Ground to End an American Crisis, and it's really a very helpful step-by-step guide interwoven with lots of really fascinating stories about his approach to building a statewide hunger coalition across hugely diverse organizations. If you think about it, hunger and food insecurity tends to be an issue that many people can get around from all different walks of life, all different political persuasions, and to try to bring them all together in a unified approach is really quite a challenge, and that's really been one of his big accomplishments, and I think we'll hear more about that now. So welcome, Jeremy Everett.
Good morning. Well, it is great to be here. It's always enjoyable to be in a room full of hunger advocates. I feel like most of the time I just need to say, just keep doing what you're doing. But the work that you're doing here in North Carolina is almost too good. I'm afraid that y'all are going to keep making Texans look bad. And so we need you to slow your roll a little bit. Luann's going to want you to do 3 meals a day all year round, and I'm going to ask you to just take a decade to do that so that we can catch up and not look so bad in Texas. But seriously, thank you for being here, and it's a privilege for me to join you today. And thanks to the work that Luann and her team do, and Alice at the team at the Center for Disease Prevention also do. It's the work that you're doing really is incredible. I also have to say that as a Baylor guy, that we're glad. I think I know what happened to UNC basketball this year. I think Roy Williams was throwing us a bone in Waco and said, "Look, to our coach Scott Drew, I think he said we'll let you have this one this year." And so I think this is probably a pact that they have between the two of them. because Roy Williams, when he was at Kansas, used to beat up on Baylor so badly. And so I think he's paying some penance this year, but I'm sure y'all will be at number 1 again next year. Well, the collaborative, maybe not. There you go. The Baylor Collaborative on Hunger and Poverty is a research and innovation project at Baylor. We have a myriad of projects. Our anchor project is the Texas Hunger Initiative. Our job, like many of you, is to try to figure out innovative solutions to address hunger and poverty in our communities. Texas, for the most part, is our laboratory. And so we're trying to find what is a scalable solution in Texas. And then we work with other states to be able to scale those solutions, hopefully so that our kids and our grandkids will wake up one day in a world without hunger and poverty. I certainly think that's possible. That's right. And for us, so I tell our students often that if you really want to end a big social problem, it doesn't matter if it's food insecurity or poverty or human trafficking, you really have to anchor yourself in 3 things. 1, you have to anchor yourself in proximity. You can't solve a social problem from a distance, right? As Brian Stevenson says. So you have to be immersed in the reality of what is happening with our families. The second thing is you have to understand what research is suggesting. Oftentimes, if we don't understand what research is suggesting, our good intentions will only do more harm than good. And so research paired with proximity are critical. And the third, I would say, is calling, or it's essentially, why are you doing what you're doing? Now, I come from a Christian faith background, and I felt an undeniable call to the issues of hunger and poverty over 20 years ago. My life will never be the same because of it, but it will be tested. Why you do what you do will be tested in time, and so you really have to be grounded in why you're doing what you're doing. So, as Alice mentioned, most of the last 20 years, my family and I have lived and worked in low-income communities around Texas and around the southern states. And one of those was San Antonio's West Side community. Now, San Antonio had the West Side community has about 150,000 residents. Another 50,000 undocumented residents that have moved there and lived there over the years. And it's a very low-income community. The median income is about $19,000 per household. And typically you have 3 generations sharing a home, so not a lot of money to go around. Now, the best high school we had in our neighborhood had a 50% dropout rate. So not only did we know that we had poverty today, but we knew that we were going to be seeing poverty there for generations if we couldn't turn the tide. Well, one of our neighbors was a champion for education. Her name was Lupe. And she and her husband were devout Catholics. They had 8 kids, ranging from high school age all the way down to elementary age. They were also the 2 primary caregivers to her wheelchair-bound parents who lived with them. And Luis was one of the few people on our block that actually had a full-time job with one employer. Most of the people on our block tried to piece together as many jobs as they could possibly find to be able to make ends meet. You know that at $7.25 an hour, the federal minimum wage, if you are able to get 40 hours a week, that's still only $13,000 a year. So it's not enough money to be able to make ends meet, and certainly that was the case for our neighbors. Well, every day, Luis would leave and go off to work, and then Lupe would send her kids off to school and then help her parents get to a senior center where they would spend the day. And then Lupe would go volunteer at the public schools. Her goal for her kids and for the kids in the neighborhood was to graduate from high school and hopefully go to San Antonio Community College. She was a fierce advocate. Well, her family knew a myriad of issues. Even though Luis had full-time employment, they were definitely underemployed. It wasn't uncommon for us to find out that their power had been cut off or the water had been cut off or that they didn't have any food in the house. I remember oftentimes during the summer months, their kids would come down and play with my 2 young sons. And when they would come down, they would play all day, and they'd love to play in the hose, especially in those hot South Texas summer days. And we knew when they were playing in the hose, oftentimes that they probably had their water cut off, and that was them kind of being able to bathe and have fun in South Texas. We also knew that when my wife would bring out a bowl of fruit and they would gobble it up, that was oftentimes the only meal that they would get when they were out of school. Well, Lupe got an ear infection, like we've all gotten, but she didn't have health insurance, and so she, like most of our neighbors, waited until it was too painful to bear, And she caught a bus and she went down to one of our emergency rooms where she sat and waited in the waiting room all day. Her name wasn't called, and she knew she needed to catch the bus to get back home before her elementary age kids got out of school, and so she did. But when she went back home later that evening, her eardrum ruptured, the infection went into her brain, she fell into a coma, and she never woke up. 2 days later, her husband and her older kids were going door to door in our neighborhood, raising money for a memorial service so that they could bury their mother. Luis came to my front porch, and he sat on my front porch, and he said, "What am I going to do? What am I going to do?" Oftentimes we treat these big social issues in our country as if each family deals with only one broken injustice. So oftentimes we talk about it as if there are 40 million Americans who experience poverty, and there are another 40 million Americans who are food insecure, and there are another 30 million Americans who don't have access to health care. But the reality is, it's the same family on the local level that is bearing the weight of all of our broken social systems. So when you're intervening and providing food for that child, you're doing something that can not only provide sustenance for them, it can be transformative in a holistic sense. When we started our work at the Texas Hunger Initiative, a couple of Baylor neuroscientists had just completed a study looking at kids that grow up in low-income, stressful households. And their definition of stressful household was that they didn't have consistent access to food or a consistent place to sleep on a daily basis. What they found is that by the time they were 2, that kids growing up in these situations affected their brain's ability to think in patterns. So by the time they got to elementary school, they couldn't fathom that 2 always followed 1 or that B always followed A, much less be able to read and write. We also did a study a few years after that looking at interventions around breakfast and after-school meals. What we found, we did a big study with Dallas Independent School District and Little Rock Independent School District. What we found is that when kids got school breakfast, that it increased academic performance in math and science specifically. It decreased discipline problems. It even decreased diet-related disease because kids were getting more access to nutritious food. One of my friends is a childhood obesity researcher, and she found that when kids got access to 3 consistent meals, regardless of what the food was, but when they got access to 3 consistent meals, it had a direct impact on diet-related disease, because often when you miss a meal and you don't have access to consistent food, you end up gorging when you do have access to food. And so she saw that just that consistency in schools had a direct correlation with early onset diabetes and diet-related disease. So these implementations are critical. That study found that simply when you change the location of where you serve breakfast and you serve it after the bell, that it also tripled participation in those districts in terms of breakfast participation. And y'all know the stories. It reduces stigma because you're not labeled the poor kid who's showing up before school to eat. It also encouraged a family atmosphere. One of our teachers in West Texas told us, she said, "Listen, I didn't want to give up the first 10 minutes of my class period." And so she remembered what life was like when she was a kid, and she remembered the family breakfast meal, and she remembered that her dad would always read the newspaper and drink his coffee and eat his breakfast. And she said he looked so dignified when he did that. And so she decided to do the same thing for her kids. So instead of giving up the first 10 minutes of the class period just to food, she said, we're going to have family breakfast. And so they would have breakfast around the table, and she would pass out children's articles, like children's Time magazine articles that had information about what was happening in the world today. And they would read while they were eating their breakfast, and then she would ask them reading comprehension questions as they were having their family breakfast. So it was transformative for the kids, because then they started to see what was happening in the classroom throughout the day and be able to connect it to what was happening in the world. Well, there are solutions to these problems. This is one of the few social issues that we have in our country where we actually have resources at the ready. We have representatives from USDA. We have 3 wonderful USDA programs targeted to kids specifically when they're in school. The school breakfast program, which is heavily underutilized, the school lunch program, and now the after-school meal program. These are 3 resources at the ready for you to be able to impact child hunger in your community. We also have great philanthropic organizations that are willing to step in and fill the gaps on the weekends and help us provide additional infrastructure during the summer months. And when these are paired together, ending child hunger is something that really is solvable. But it's going to take time. And I see you. I know the work that you're doing, and I know the fact that many of you are working hard to end child hunger in your community is not like you're doing it with the support in a parade every day. I know that many of your administrators or some of your teachers, maybe some of your principals, are a barrier to you implementing 3 meals a day. That's going to happen. We took our students to D.C. and they got to spend some time with Congressman John Lewis, the civil rights leader who's been a congressman from Georgia for a long time. He told our students, he said, most people think that organizers left the South because of threat of violence. He said, but the reality is, he said, most organizers left the South when we were doing civil rights work, not because of a threat of violence, but because of the monotony of organizing. The day-to-day monotony of organizing. Oftentimes when we see people who do heroic things and we think about these tremendous acts of bravery, but the reality is, I think what is heroic is showing up to your job on a day-to-day basis, and it's taking that teacher on, it's taking that principal on. It's not shaming them for their opinion, but it's listening to them, but it's ultimately working with them to transform the social conditions for the kids that are in their care. You've got to be advocates, and you got to keep showing up. Ultimately, the only way that we're going to end hunger is something that we're going to have to commit our lives to. The great William Wilberforce, the British parliamentarian from the 18th century, spent his entire career working to end the British slave trade, something that had never been done. He ultimately accomplished that goal 3 days before he died. 3 days before he died. He literally gave his life to the cause. But one of his biographers noted that actually wasn't his greatest accomplishment. His greatest accomplishment was ending the very idea that slavery was an acceptable form of commerce. Because until that point, throughout all human history, it was just a normal social condition. It was just how we created wealth. Well, likewise for you, as you're slugging it out on the day-to-day basis, trying to ensure that your kids have 3 meals a day, you also need to end the very idea that hunger and poverty are acceptable social conditions. That's right. They are a humanitarian crisis that we created, and we have the capacity to address. If you do, then may it be said of you that you committed your life to the cause and that you bent the world towards justice. Thank you.